I'd say the majority of it is in English.
Okay.
And there's definitely some that's in Portuguese.
Sure.
Absolutely. You can just copy and paste that in ChatGPT and say, hey, translate to English.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Biz Dev Podcast, the podcast about developing your business. I'm David Baxter, your host. This week, I'm joined per usual by Gary Voigt. How are you? You look like you're in the dark. You okay over there?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I cannot complain. More importantly, I am joined by John Petitte, who is the CEO and co-founder of Amplifi Labs. Welcome, man. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me. How are you guys doing?
Cannot
Pretty
complain.
good.
So you run Amplifi Labs, which, if I understand correctly, is very similar to what we do. You build custom software. How long have you been doing that?
Yeah. So first, I guess a clarification. We have two business lines. One is custom software development, and the other one is staff augmentation.
Gotcha.
So each makes up about 50% of our business right now.
So how did you start? Which one was it, or both?
We started with projects.
Okay.
And then we added staff augmentation onto it. And now we can talk about this a little bit more later, but we've noticed an opening in demand in the market, and staff augmentation we expect to grow dramatically more over time.
So pretend I'm an idiot. It's not hard. What is staff augmentation?
Staff augmentation is when a customer already has internal processes for building things, right? Just in general. And they need extra individuals to be added into their team. And there are a number of different reasons why they wouldn't bring those folks on as W-2 employees, right? But that's the critical, let's say, aspect as to why they're going to come to somebody like us, right? They have the processes in place. They just need more experts in specific areas to be added to their team.
Okay. So how did you guys were doing projects? And you guys have been around 5 or 6 years? Is that about right?
5.5 at
Nice.
this point, yep.
How did you guys go from projects to staff augmentation? Was there a client just said, hey, can you help? And you were off to the races, or how did that happen?
Essentially. So we're up to this point, we've been very market driven. So we get out there, we interact with people, we're working with people, we analyze what people need, the type of problems they're trying to solve, and they come to us with specific types of problems that they needed solved. And we would just say, sure, we can do that, which is a very normal thing for startups to do. You, as Guy Kawasaki would say, you shut up and take the money, and then you solve their problem. I think Teddy Roosevelt said something like, when somebody asks you if you can do something, first you say yes, and then you figure out how you're going to do it. Mm-hmm. So that was very much our philosophy for the first 3.5, 4 years. And staff augmentation became a big part of our business when one of our partners, Patrick Clancy, runs a dev shop called Bitface. Awesome guy, really classy guy. He came to us and he had a project with a much larger customer. Patrick at the time was focusing strictly on web development, React front end, and they had mobile components to it. He said, hey, will you guys help me on this proposal? And we can get a much larger project from this. We said, yeah. So we merged together for that project. We did that for about a year. And then that customer said, we really want to switch over to staff augmentation rather than you guys running the projects. Because they were a scale up that had grown by acquisition, and they wanted to become a much more mature organization in terms of execution. So that's why they wanted to switch over to staff aug, because they wanted to mature that portion of their organization. So we said, okay, sure. So we switched over, we modified the way we operated, and that kind of became the first trigger point for we're going to have a mature staff augmentation department. So it was just very market driven, right? Customers need this. And we said, yeah, let's adapt to it.
So before staff aug, did you have the process and procedure that each dev that was on your team, because these were internal hires, right? Were they dedicated only to that project beforehand?
No, that case, they were primarily dedicated, right? That was a big project. Customer was pretty big, so it was consuming a lot of their time. But in general, prior to that, we would shuffle people around based on projects that had needs, project hours, et cetera, trying to maintain budgets on projects, those sorts of things. So, it was very fluid.
I asked because I would think if it was us, our guys jump around pretty regularly. And if I had gone from, say, our biggest client says, hey, we're going to do staff aug, and I want your guys to now be my guys that I'm managing, those guys, our other projects would take a major hit because those guys are now gone from day to day my company.
Correct.
So did you have that transition, or was it smoother than that?
Because they were so dedicated in that instance, it was a little bit smoother.
Okay.
Right? It took a little bit of time, but it wasn't as, let's say, chaotic as the situation that you described.
Yeah. Okay. So so I saw from LinkedIn, I saw that you guys, most of your devs are in Brazil. Is that correct?
That's right. Correct.
So our audience has heard my team is all US based. We're all over the place, but it's a big thing for us as Big Pixel to only hire in the US. And so the audience has heard that spiel a million times. What I want to hear is when offshoring works from your perspective. Obviously, this is your model and it's working for y'all. Great. How does that work for y'all? How? Because there's all horror stories, and I'm sure you've heard them. But how do you get around those horror stories, and how do you make it work for your clients?
So I'll start with the history of why most of the company is in Brazil. So originally, I'll fast forward a little bit through my entrepreneurial history, but I had a consulting firm with a fellow entrepreneur of mine, and we just started it. It was maybe just a couple months, right? We maybe had a handful of customers who were starting to pay us a little bit of money to do things. And we'd actually been working together for a while. He needed to get a little bit more stable because he had a kid on the way. So he went out and got a job in California at Rigetti Computing, and it was an awesome opportunity. But he said, hey, look, you can keep the consulting firm, do whatever you want with it. And I was like, okay.
He was your dev, or were you the dev?
I was
or
the
neither.
Dev. That's correct.
You were the dev.
I was the dev. That's right. That's right. And he said, you can do whatever you want with it. I was like, all right, cool. Makes sense. So I started working through my network in the Raleigh area, and I reconnected with Rod Greco, and he had just started a dev shop at pretty much the same time that we had. Now, Rod is Brazilian. I think he's actually a U.S. citizen now. He's been in the U.S. for maybe 15 years at this point, something like that. And so using his connections down in Brazil, he leveraged that to focus his dev shop on nearshore software development. So we merged together. I honestly knew nothing about Brazil, or like I may not have even known that they speak Portuguese in Brazil. So we merged together and was like, okay, all right, cool. Let's do this. So then we added Paulo Reek as co-founder and CTO a little while later. And that's when we got underway. So it was really just opportunistic around whether or not we were working in the US or Brazil. Now, the opportunistic portion of it is, let's say, important because previous to this, I never actually worked at any big software companies, right? I never worked at Facebook or Apple or honestly any software job previously. No one had paid me to write software. My background, my degrees were in chemical engineering and biochemistry. And I'd worked in the pharmaceutical and medical device industry for 4 years as a consultant prior to this. So during that time, I'd been teaching myself computer science for years, right? But no one had paid me to do anything. And so there was nobody out there saying, yeah, I trust that John can build something, right? I knew I could. I'm an engineer at heart. I know how to do that stuff. But it's different when you've got folks who've worked with you for a couple years prior and say, yeah, I trust John. He knows what he's doing. Go ahead and hire his team and they'll get it done. So having a dev shop that was nearshore allowed us to compete on price initially. And that allowed us to gain credibility. And we've just taken that momentum and continued to work into that niche because that's where we set up, right? That's what we know really well. And our structure has allowed us to do that very effectively because we know, let's say, the Brazilian market very well.
Seeing that you have deep roots in Brazil, are a lot of your clients Brazilian based?
None of them are. We're strictly United States. Yeah. We've had some come to us and say, hey, we really want to work with you. We got close with one, but unfortunately, one of the co-founders got sick and they had to put things on hold. But typically, we price ourselves out of the Brazilian market, right? Which is why we really focus on US.
So your project management is where?
In Brazil.
In Brazil. So I'm a client. I call you and I'm like, dude, I need you to build me this awesome gizmo. And you're like, cool. Here's your team in Brazil. Is that spammo? There's no US contact from that point on for all intents and purposes.
Our business development side is pretty much on the US.
Mhm.
So there's that. Other than that, everything's in Brazil.
Okay.
Everything's in Brazil. And we were fully remote, right, from
Sure.
birth, right? So companies that understand that, it's very natural to them. I've actually never met Paulo Reek in person, our CTO. Only ever known him via video calls. And it's because we started right before the pandemic. At first, we're like, oh, we're not making that much money. We need to save money, invest into the business. We're not going to fly out and visit anybody. Then the pandemic hit. I guess we're not traveling for a while. And I guess we don't need an office. So just continue. And then after the pandemic, all right, we're growing so fast. I don't have time to go visit you. We need to focus on growing the business. And we still haven't done it. So maybe at the end of this year.
We're all remote as well. And I know that as a remote company, building culture, building a company that people want to engage with every day is hard. And we're all speaking the same language.
Mhm.
So I would imagine that in your case, and correct me where I'm wrong, it seems like you'd be very bifurcated. You've got all the Brazilians, which is most of your company.
Mhm.
They probably
That's
have
right.
a culture. And then you have the Americans who probably have their own culture. And there's probably some mixing, but not a ton. Is that fair?
Latin America, I think, is one benefit is that it's fairly close to
Mhm.
US culture.
Yep.
And US culture, even in itself, is divided into
Sure.
different cultures. So I think in the US, people are much more accustomed to that than they used to be. So there have been certain aspects where I chat with Paulo and he says, yeah, we see things this way, we see things that way. These are, let's say, environmental or cultural differences that influence the way people react to certain things. But it's not that much different than, let's say, if you were working in New York and then you hired a bunch of people in California. Like, you're still going to need some guidance on this isn't normal in California, or this isn't normal down in South Carolina. This isn't normal in New York. I'd say it's closer to that than it would be a cultural difference between the United States and Japan, which is just
Sure.
cavernous.
Yeah.
Right.
Big difference.
Yeah.
But I would think, I'm assuming you guys live on something like Slack or Teams or something like
Yes.
that.
Slack. That's right. Google Meets. Exactly.
But the core difference that I would see, if I go to my Slack and I open up any channel, I can read and I can dive in anywhere I want to. But if I'm the American in your company and I open up Slack, 3/4 of the channels are in Portuguese, I would assume.
There are some, but everybody gets hired because they can speak English.
Okay.
I'd say the majority of it is in English.
Okay.
And there's definitely some that's in Portuguese.
Sure.
Absolutely. You can just copy and paste that in ChatGPT and say, hey, translate to English.
That's
and it's
fair, true.
and LMs have made it so easy to do translations that when I'm, chatting with friends in Japan online, instead of trying to manually do the translation, I send it in English and Japanese. I just have ChatGPT translate to Japanese for me. So even those barriers are going away. But
That's
everybody
crazy.
does speak English in the company.
Okay. That's just fascinating. So now you're seeing your future is in staff aug. You're just finding that's where people are leaning, which I think the term I've heard is the body shop, right? That's what I've heard staff aug is called. And
Yeah, people mills.
People
is another
mills.
term.
Yeah.
That's right.
I've always, and I've worked,
Human capital.
Yep.
I have worked adjacent to staff aug companies. And I've always thought that it was really hard to, those people, they're basically not your employees except from an HR perspective, right? You never see them. They're not coming to a Christmas party. They don't know who anyone else even is on the team. And I was like, man, that's not what I want to build. But I also know there's a big, huge pile of money right there because it's, for all intents and purposes, once you've found them and you've stuffed the person in that hole, you just make free money from that point on. You make a percentage, correct me if I'm wrong, of their
Correct.
bill rate
That's
from
right.
that point on. And it's
That's
just like
right.
free money. As long as they're not crazy and you have HR problems, it's free money for as long as they're out there. And so I have a friend who ran one. He's like, dude, it's just nuts because the margins are locked in and they're forever. They get on this project for 3 years, 40 hours a week. I make a number of it. It was something like $25 an hour off the top forever. And I was like, I see the appeal. I do. But in my case, I was like, man, but I like building things. That's my heartbeat. I like building things. I like dealing with people. But I totally
we had
get
a guest. We had a guest prior that was, she ran like I guess it would be like a creative and advertising kind of agency that was all staff aug in Canada. And it was this very similar model. But she also had most of her employees or people that she put into positions were offshore from Canada. Not in Canada, but she was in Canada and offshoring in there. Yeah.
So I know what you mean, David. I know what you mean. Paulo and I have gone through this exact same thoughts and conversations. In the end, what we always told ourselves was we want to build something big and great. And we're not really concerned with what that is because it will allow us to do the next even bigger and greater thing, right? Because we are, in the end, Paulo and I are builders, right? We are both engineers. And the interesting thing about staff aug, it's got its own problems, right?
Sure.
The biggest thing is that you're working with people and people are dirty, right? Their lives are my life, everybody, nobody has a clean, perfect, like a well-oiled machine life that's just rolling along.
Sure.
People get sick. People have family members who die. Like people, sometimes they get depressed, right? Things just happen to people. And so you have, in a crude way, like your product is people, but they're human beings, right? So there is definitely a dynamic to it where something's going to happen to somebody along the way, right? But that's just the law of life. It's going to come at you and it's going to punch you in the face. You don't know when that is. And so for each of these individuals, at some point, you're going to have to help them through it, help the customer through it, figure out the best path forward. So that is definitely something that is, say, a little bit different than if you're running projects, right? When you're running projects, you can keep that more internal to the team. When you have a third party that's directly interfacing with this person, it's a little bit more open, right? Because the customer, if something's happening to somebody, they need to know at least there's something going on, right? Somebody's grandmother died. Crazy stuff, like somebody's child died. You have to handle that in a way that's compassionate to everybody, compassionate to the customer who's got customers of their own that they need to fill, compassionate to the person who's going through the worst thing in their life could possibly endure. So that's a different dimension to it. But the building aspect comes from the fact that there's a lot of beauty to me in systems that just work really well. And the systematization of getting people with the right other people, right? Engineers, QA, PM, with the right customers doing the right kind of work and just cranking along and people are happy with what they're doing. Putting together those systems where it's just like a machine, it just turns and everybody's comfortable and they're feeling fulfilled. That to me is a very beautiful thing, right? I love those types of systems. Even with staff aug, I can get this really beautiful sense of fulfillment by seeing all of the gears and all of the people working in a way that they enjoy and produces a good outcome.
Big Pixel builds world-class custom software and amazing apps. Our team of pros puts passion into every one of our projects. Our design-infused development leans heavily on delivering a great experience for our clients and their clients. From startups to enterprises, we can help craft your ideas into real-world products that help your business do better business.
So how big, vaguely, do you see Amplifi Labs getting? Or is this a stepping stone to I'm going to get it this big. I'm going to sell it. I'm going to do something else. And we're going to keep riding this train. Like how big, like I had an idea in my head of how big I wanted Big Pixel to grow. And I've always joked that if and when I reach that, I reserve the right to change my mind. But
Yeah.
I'm curious, do you have that same kind of thought? Or do you have this is where I want to be a 10 million, 20 million, 100 million, billion, whatever in your head? And that's what you're striving for? Because you're like, we want to be big. We don't really care what it is.
Paulo and I have always said to each other that the path is building bigger, more interesting things. We know that right now, the only trajectory to do that is growing Amplifi Labs. Exactly where that goes, we're flexible. And is it with an acquisition? Is it with just continuing to grow it? And then Amplifi Labs funds other bigger ideas, more interesting ideas. We're totally open to it. We run the calculus of what gets us closer to doing bigger and more interesting things with every decision. And it'll change over time, right? What looks like the decision that we make a year from now, maybe not be the case. So we're very flexible.
You remind me of a friend of mine. He just loved business. He wanted to run a business. He didn't care what that business, he actually bought one. Very random kind of business. One of those businesses that you're like, I didn't know that kind of thing existed. But he's grown it. He's tripled its size or whatever. I can't remember the numbers, of course. But it wasn't the thing. It was the business. It was creating the process like you were talking about. You sound very similar to him. Like your passion, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but your passion isn't necessarily building software in StaffHog. It's running a business. And this just happens to be the one you're running right now.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that became clear to me in my, let's say, senior into super senior year in college at NC State. That's when I discovered the entrepreneurship program there, and everything just clicked into place, right? I realized why I wasn't great at competing in a corporate environment. I realized why I was ultra competitive, but everything that everyone was competing at just really wasn't that super interested in. I didn't feel like I understood the rules of those games. But then once I found entrepreneurship, I realized, okay, yes, this is why I haven't fit in anywhere else, right? This is what I should be doing. What you described matches perfectly.
That's so interesting. You're a pinball. You were a chemical engineer. Was that right? Chemical engineer?
Chemical engineer and biochemistry were my 2 degrees.
Chemical engineer major, bounced over, started writing software, bounced over StaffHog, doing both together, building up. And now you don't know what's next. You do know what's next. You're already starting another business. Correct. And that's all around AI and LLMs and all that. What is that one? And is that tied to Amplifi, or is that just totally separate? Or are you and Paulo doing that together? Like, how's that working out?
The co-founders of that business are myself, Paulo, and Hal Berman. And that business uses large language models to correctly categorize the $3 trillion worth of goods that come into the United States every year for taxation. So everything that comes into the United States needs to be taxed properly. You need to figure out how it's taxed so that you can then pay the proper tax. That is a very manual process right now for the entire country. That
sounds horrible.
It is. Yeah, that might be an understatement.
Ooh. I just found it's tangentially related. I just found out if you Airbnb your house, then everything in your house, that's not like part of the house itself, like let's say a rug, becomes a state taxable thing.
Really?
Which most people don't know, because it makes you income. It makes you revenue, right?
Oh, interesting.
And so if you bought a nice couch for your Airbnb, that thing, and here's the fun part, it's not like normal depreciation, like I bought a laptop. It is, let's say it was $1,000 couch. You can depreciate that over 10 years, but the tax never goes down below 25% of the original value.
Really?
So you will always pay that, let's say in this fictional thing, $250 of value, that'll be taxed forever. And that's every single thing in your Airbnb. And most people, and I only learned this just because I was talking to this person, I don't have an Airbnb or anything. I was just blown away because I'm like, how many people actually know that? And then the other question is, how would they even calculate that? But anyway,
Correct.
crazy, right? And the counties know this, and the counties are coming.
Oh,
They're
they
trying.
are.
They're coming.
That was my next question.
Yeah. They know this, and they want their money. This is coming. Yeah, for sure. Which is just crazy. It was just, again, idle conversation I was having, but wild. That's the thing. Sorry. So you're talking about taxes across imports, right?
Imports. That's correct. That's right. So everybody, every Fortune 500, every Fortune 100, it doesn't matter, right? All of the big players require this type of work done because they're all moving things into the United States.
But don't think if I'm making refrigerators and I'm bringing stuff over, I know I've got 12 refrigerators in that container. I know what my taxes are. Like I would assume these big boys know what they're doing. Am I wrong?
So that is so fascinating. It's so fascinating because it's not that simple. And I'll give you an example of one area where you'd think it would be, right? We have our 2024 line of refrigerators from GE, right? Classify everything once, you're done. One of the areas that is unexpected is that pretty much everything coming into the US is logged via a PDF invoice.
That sounds awesome.
And so that PDF invoice then has to be taken by a human being, and then the things on the invoice are classified. So the automation of it is extremely poor.
You would think pre-AI, this would already been a solved someone has made.
They tried. Hal came to me in 2016 saying, John, this is a huge problem. So Hal is an expert in this space. Okay. He is one of the few folks who've passed the broker's exam, has passed the bar exam, and his family has been doing this for a generation. He came to me in 2016 and said, John, this is a disaster, right? It's all manual. They've been trying to automate this for 10 years. Doesn't work. And the biggest names have been trying to do it. Deloitte, Tradewin, like huge amounts of money have been poured into trying to automate this, and it's all failed. In 2016, he and I sat down and I said, yeah, here's some ways you could do it, but nothing really looked inspiring compared to what everyone else had tried already.
That's very cool.
Well, John, since you recently discovered that you are an entrepreneur at heart more than an engineer or developer, what would your top 3 pieces of advice be for any other new entrepreneur or business that are starting?
Yeah. So for me, the number one thing that made a difference was finding the right co-founder in Paulo Rique. And that connection to somebody who is 100% aligned with the idea that we're going to build something. Life is going to be hard, but that's okay because this is what we were born to do. That made all the difference, because no matter what you do, it's going to get difficult. It's going to get hard. There's no way to avoid it. And so finding that person who can sit there beside you and just say, don't worry about the problems, focus on solutions. Don't worry about the problems, focus on the solutions. We're going to get there. We're going to get there. That is huge. It is invaluable. You can't calculate the impact that has. So for me, that's the number one thing. And it took me 8 years, like almost a decade, to find the right person. I worked with a bunch of different folks, but it took me 8 years to find the right person to do it with. The other one that I would say is specifically directed towards the way folks talk about entrepreneurship is ignore the outliers, right? Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, those guys are outliers, right?
For sure.
And if you think that you're going to emulate them and be successful, that's just not correct. For one, they're outliers to begin with. 2, the stories that you do hear, they're not true. The stories that they want published. You don't actually know what's going on behind the scenes. You don't actually know how they work. Even the people who worked with them, let's say you talk to them, you're still getting some secondhand filtered knowledge around the reality of how those guys operate, what their lives are like, etc. So completely ignore the outliers. Right? That's the other one that I think will have a major impact on folks. The other one is back to what I said previously around life getting hard. If you are serious about going out and being an entrepreneur, save your money like you already don't have a job today. So because I knew that this was the life that I was going to have, right out of school, I worked on a company with a friend of mine, David Ivey, great guy. He's now the CTO of Fly Exclusive. We did that for a year, and we decided we didn't like the market, cut it off. We weren't sad. We were like, yeah, we learned a bunch. Then we immediately went out and got real jobs. And I saved money for 4 years. I was still in college, right? I was making great money, but we had no furniture in the apartment other than like a desk and an office chair for my now wife and girlfriend back then, and drove her nuts, right? You can't do that forever, but man, we saved a ton of money. And that really made a difference when there were 3 years that I was making no money. And every startup I have ever done, every single one I have ever done in the founding team has run out of money, and life got real hard. I can't pay for my kids' insurance. I can't afford rent, right? I'm going to be kicked out on the street. Like, these are real problems that happen to people. Save your money to reduce the probability that you will have to go through that. So those are my 3 pieces of advice.
I like those, man.
Yeah, real world practical advice.
That's down in the dirty muck of the trenches. I like
That's
it.
right.
So many of and not that there's good and bad ones. Gary likes to judge people while they give their advice. It's weird.
I don't
Like,
judge
that was
the
crap.
people.
Yeah,
I
your
let them
advice
know if I
sucks.
thought their advice was good or bad. But yeah,
Right, real time. It's great. It's good.
Making
good
me
TV.
sound
Anyway,
awesome. Thanks.
but yeah, you're welcome. But that was good because that was very practical. I remember for me, that last one in particular, my wife and I were deciding whether or not we were going to go and do basically Big Pixel either for on its own or for the company I was working at. And I knew, and I was getting a good developer salary at the time. And so we started cutting back. I think we took, I don't know. It was something like a 40% pay cut virtually. Like, I didn't lose the money, but like for the last year before I made the jump to see, could we do it? And I'm like, okay, because I know I can't make good developer money, but I might be able to make this much money. And so we did that. And then when I went out on my own, my wife goes, this is great. This is, you can't lose any more money. This is what you have to make. I support you, but you have to make this much money. And no pressure, but yeah, no, that's wonderful. Good advice. All right, Gary,
Okay.
you're supposed to say something now.
I didn't know if you were done. Sorry.
I'm done.
All right, John, if anybody wants to learn more about you or your 2 businesses, how can they get in touch with you? Where can they find you?
They can check me out on LinkedIn to see everything that I'm up to. I don't know if there will be a LinkedIn link or anything associated with this.
Yeah, we'll put the links in the descriptions.
Beautiful, thanks. And to learn more about Amplifi Labs, they can go to Amplifi with an I at the end instead of a Y, amplifilabs.com.
Very cool. Thank you so much, man. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Christy Pronto, Content Marketing Director here at Big Pixel. Thank you for listening to this episode of the BizDev Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Shoot us an email, hello@thebigpixel.net. The BizDev Podcast is produced and presented by Big Pixel. See you next week. Until then, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Threads, YouTube, and LinkedIn.